What started as a quiet afternoon quickly escalated into a full-on showdown with Karen. Mark Thompson's life had been a carefully curated masterpiece of order and precision. At 47, he embodied the quintessential suburban homeowner, the middle management professional who found solace in the meticulous care of his personal domain. His two-story colonial-style home, nestled in the Oak Ridge Estates subdivision, stood as a beacon of maintained perfection on Maple Grove Street. The house itself was a reflection of Mark's personality, symmetrical, well-preserved, and unwaveringly consistent. Every weekend for the past 15 years, he had dedicated countless hours to his landscaping, transforming what was once a simple suburban lot into a horticultural haven. His front yard was a carefully choreographed display of botanical precision. Geometric flower beds bordered by immaculately trimmed boxwood hedges, a lawn so green and uniform it could have been mistaken for a golf course, and a collection of rare rose varieties that were the envy of local gardening enthusiasts. Mark's dedication to his property went beyond mere aesthetics. Each plant, each carefully placed stone, each manicured shrub told a story of patience and passion. The rose garden in particular was his pride and joy. Inherited from his mother, an accomplished botanist who had traveled the world collecting rare botanical specimens, the garden was more than just a collection of plants. It was a living memorial, a connection to his late mother's legacy and her lifelong love of horticulture. Professionally, Mark worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. His work demanded the same level of precision he applied to his home, methodical, organized, with an eye for detail that set him apart from his colleagues. Divorced for 7 years, he had channeled much of his emotional energy into maintaining his home and pursuing his gardening passion. His neighbors respected him, if not always warmly, and certainly with a sense of admiration for his consistency and dedication. The Oak Ridge Estates had always been a relatively quiet neighborhood. Most residents were established professionals or retirees who took pride in their properties and maintained an unspoken code of mutual respect. Annual block parties, occasional neighborhood watch meetings, and polite waves characterized the social interactions. Mark had been a fixture in this community for nearly 2 decades, known for his reliability and commitment to maintaining the area's pristine appearance. Little did he know that the delicate balance of his carefully constructed world was about to be disrupted. The Wilsons' arrival would prove to be more than just a typical neighborhood transition. Their approach to family, property, and community standards would challenge everything Mark believed about suburban etiquette and mutual respect. As he stood on his front porch that late summer morning, coffee in hand and surveying his immaculate lawn, Mark could not have anticipated the storm brewing just around the corner. The moving truck that had arrived the previous week, bearing the Wilson family's belongings, represented more than just a new set of neighbors. It was the harbinger of a conflict that would test his patience, challenge his principles, and ultimately reveal the complex dynamics of suburban life. The morning was crisp, the grass still wet with dew, and Mark's roses were just beginning to bloom, a sight that always brought him a sense of profound peace. How quickly that peace would be shattered remained to be seen. The Wilson family arrived with a whirlwind of chaos that seemed to defy Mark's carefully maintained order. Jennifer Wilson, a stay-at-home mother in her early 30s, appeared perpetually overwhelmed by her 3 children, Tyler, 7, Emma, 5, and Jake, 3. Their moving truck had barely pulled away before the children began exploring the neighborhood with a reckless abandon that made Mark's heart race with anxiety. On a Tuesday morning, just 2 days after the Wilsons moved in, Mark first witnessed the true extent of the children's destructive potential. He had just finished his morning routine of watering his prized rose garden, a delicate process that involved carefully measured nutrients and precise watering techniques passed down from his mother. The roses were in their early summer bloom, a stunning array of hybrid teas and climbing varieties that represented years of careful cultivation. Tyler Wilson was the first to breach Mark's carefully constructed boundaries. The boy, with a mischievous glint in his eye, began running through the meticulously arranged flower beds. Mark watched in horror as the child's oversized sneakers trampled his rare constant spray climbing roses, a variety so delicate that each plant had taken 3 years to establish. The rose's pink blooms, carefully supported by intricate trellises, began to snap and scatter under the boy's careless feet. "Tyler," Mark called out, his voice a mixture of shock and controlled anger. "Stop right there." The boy seemed to pause for a moment, looking directly at Mark with a defiance that belied his young age. Then, with what appeared to be intentional malice, he took another deliberate step, crushing a particularly rare yellow rose that Mark had cultivated from a cutting obtained from a botanical garden in England. Jennifer Wilson, who had been unloading boxes from their SUV, looked up casually. "Tyler, honey, be careful," she called out, her voice lacking any real conviction or urgency. It was more of a passive suggestion than a genuine attempt to control her child's behavior. Mark approached her, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the internal turmoil. "Excuse me," he began, his voice measured and controlled, "but your son is destroying my rose garden." These are very rare and delicate plants that take years to cultivate. Jennifer offered a dismissive smile that immediately set Mark's nerves on edge. "Oh, he's just playing. Kids will be kids, right?" She returned to her unpacking, seemingly unconcerned about the damage her child was causing. The extent of the destruction became apparent as Mark surveyed the damage. 3 of his most prized rose bushes had been irreparably damaged. The constant spray, which had taken 3 years of careful pruning and nurturing, was now a scattered mess of broken stems and crushed petals. A rare yellow David Austin rose, a memorial plant from his mother's last botanical expedition, lay in pieces, its delicate blooms ground into the soft earth. Mark realized this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. This was a fundamental clash of values, his meticulously maintained property versus the Wilsons' apparent lack of respect for boundaries and personal space. As he began to document the damage with careful photographs, Mark knew this was just the beginning. The peace of Oak Ridge Estates had been irrevocably disrupted, and a conflict was brewing that would test the limits of neighborly patience and suburban decorum. The weeks following the initial incident became a test of Mark's patience and diplomatic skills. A new confrontation could create lasting neighborhood tension, so he attempted to address the situation with measured restraint. After consulting with a few longtime neighbors and reflecting on the best approach, Mark decided to draft a polite but firm letter to the Wilsons. His letter carefully outlined the damage to his garden, included photographic evidence, and requested a conversation about establishing clear boundaries for the children. He detailed the monetary and sentimental value of the destroyed plants, particularly emphasizing the rare rose varieties that could not simply be replaced. Mark had the letter professionally typed, maintaining a tone of respectful communication while clearly stating the impact of their children's actions. Jennifer Wilson's response was both dismissive and infuriating. She dropped the letter back in Mark's mailbox with a hastily scrawled note. "Boys will be boys. Lighten up." The casual disregard for both his property and his feelings pushed Mark closer to the edge of his carefully maintained composure. The children's behavior continued to escalate. Tyler, Emma, and Jake seemed to view Mark's yard as their personal playground. They would cut across his lawn, leaving trampled grass and mud tracks. Toys would mysteriously appear scattered across his meticulously maintained flower beds. On multiple occasions, Mark watched in disbelief as the children threw balls, kicked soccer goals, and played rough games that consistently encroached on his property. What troubled Mark most was the apparent lack of parental supervision. Jennifer Wilson seemed perpetually distracted, often seen scrolling on her phone while her children ran wild. The neighborhood's weekly block party became a particular source of tension. Mark observed the Wilsons' children causing minor destruction, knocking over potted plants, running through carefully arranged buffet tables, and creating chaos that went unchecked. Mark began taking preventative measures. He installed a decorative wrought iron fence around his front yard, carefully designed to be aesthetically pleasing while providing a clear physical boundary. The fence was expensive, a significant investment that pained him financially but seemed necessary to protect his property. He also set up discreet security cameras, documenting each incursion and potential damage. The other neighbors began to take notice. Some supported Mark silently, offering sympathetic looks and quiet words of support. Others seemed uncomfortable with the growing tension. Old Mrs. Henderson, who had lived on the street for over 4 decades, suggested Mark try to be more understanding. "Children are children," she would say, though Mark found little comfort in her advice. His attempts at diplomatic resolution continued. He tried scheduling a face-to-face meeting with Jennifer and her husband, hoping to establish clear ground rules. Each attempt was met with excuses, rescheduling, or outright ignored. The Wilsons seemed to treat his concerns as a personal affront rather than a reasonable request for mutual respect. The breaking point was approaching. Mark's carefully constructed world, a testament to years of hard work, precision, and personal pride, was being systematically dismantled by a family that seemed to have no respect for boundaries or personal property. His garden, once a source of peace and connection to his late mother's memory, was becoming a battleground. As summer progressed, Mark realized that this was no longer just about protecting his plants. It was about maintaining the very fabric of neighborhood decorum, about respect, and about protecting the sanctity of personal space. The Wilsons had no idea of the storm that was brewing, a confrontation that would soon bring their clash of values to a dramatic and unexpected conclusion. The antique garden gnome had been more than just a decorative piece. It was a cherished memory, a hand-painted ceramic figure that Mark's mother had brought back from a botanical expedition to Germany decades ago. Crafted by a small-town artisan in the Black Forest region, the gnome represented one of the last gifts his mother had given him before her passing. Its delicate paint, the intricate details of its gardening pose, and the weathered patina spoke of years of careful preservation. It was a Saturday afternoon when the incident occurred. Mark had just finished pruning his rose bushes, carefully collecting the trimmed branches for precise disposal. The summer heat was intense, and sweat beaded on his forehead as he worked meticulously around the garden. From the corner of his eye, he spotted the Wilson children entering his yard, a sight that immediately set his nerves on edge. Tyler, the oldest, was wielding a plastic baseball bat with a recklessness that suggested imminent destruction. Emma and Jake followed close behind, their small feet trampling the carefully maintained grass. Mark watched in growing horror as they approached his prized garden gnome, which stood sentinel near a collection of rare hybrid tea roses. "Hey," Mark called out, his voice a mixture of warning and barely contained frustration. "Get out of my yard. Right now." The children seemed to pause momentarily, but Tyler's grip on the baseball bat tightened. With a look of deliberate defiance, he swung the bat directly at the garden gnome. The ceramic figure seemed to wobble in slow motion before crashing to the ground, shattering into dozens of pieces. The delicate hand-painted details, the gnome's tiny gardening tools, the intricate folds of its ceramic clothing, were now nothing more than fragments scattered across Mark's carefully maintained flower bed. Something inside Mark snapped. He strode forward, his calm demeanor replaced by a controlled but intense anger. "That's enough," he shouted, his voice carrying a weight of authority that stopped the children in their tracks. "You cannot continue to destroy my property." Tyler took a step back, sensing the genuine anger in Mark's voice. Emma began to cry, while little Jake looked confused by the sudden tension. Mark knew he was treading a fine line. He was careful not to physically touch the children, but his presence was commanding and unmistakably serious. "Go home," he said, his voice low and intense. "Right now." The children scrambled away, leaving Mark standing among the shattered remains of the garden gnome. The destruction was complete. The ceramic pieces looked like broken dreams scattered across his beloved garden. Each fragment felt like a personal violation, a destruction of a memory that could never be restored. Mark carefully began collecting the pieces, his hands shaking slightly. The gnome had been irreplaceable, a unique piece of art and a connection to his mother that could never be recreated. Years of memories of careful preservation had been destroyed in a moment of childish recklessness. As he gathered the fragments, Mark realized this was no longer just about a garden or property lines. This was about respect, about the fundamental right to preserve something meaningful. The Wilsons had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Whatever came next would be a definitive moment in their neighborhood conflict. Little did he know how dramatically that moment would unfold. Karen Wilson arrived like a tornado of maternal fury, her presence instantly transforming the quiet suburban street into a stage for dramatic confrontation. At 62, she was a formidable woman who had spent decades believing that her grandchildren could do no wrong. A retired elementary school administrator from a small town in Ohio, Karen had cultivated a reputation for being both protective and confrontational. She had been visiting the Wilsons that afternoon, helping Jennifer with childcare and household management. When Tyler burst through the front door, crying and recounting a story of a mean man who had yelled at them, Karen's protective instincts immediately went into overdrive. Jennifer's typically passive response, a half-hearted, "Oh, really?" only fueled Karen's growing anger. "That's unacceptable," Karen declared, grabbing her oversized handbag and marching towards Mark's property. Her walk was a combination of righteous indignation and small-town confrontational energy. Neighbors who were out tending their lawns or washing cars paused, sensing the impending drama. As she approached Mark, her voice reached a pitch that could shatter glass. "How dare you terrorize children?" she screamed, her face reddening with each word. "You're nothing but a bully." The accusation hung in the air, drawing the attention of several nearby residents who began to cautiously emerge from their homes. Mark, still holding fragments of the broken garden gnome, tried to maintain his composure. "Ma'am," he began calmly, "your grandchildren were destroying my property. That gnome was an irreplaceable family heirloom." But Karen was beyond reason. Her perception of events had been entirely shaped by Tyler's dramatically skewed account, a tale of a scary neighbor who had seemingly threatened innocent children. In her mind, Mark was a predator, a threat to be eliminated. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and began dialing 911. Her fingers trembled with a mixture of anger and what seemed like rehearsed performance. "I'm reporting a potential child predator," she announced loudly, ensuring the entire neighborhood could hear her dramatic declaration. The 911 dispatcher tried to calm her, asking for specific details. Karen's description grew more hysterical with each moment. "He's threatening my grandchildren," she insisted, her voice rising to a theatrical pitch. "He's a danger to the entire neighborhood." Mark stood in stunned silence, the broken pieces of the gnome still in his hands. The irony was not lost on him. He was being portrayed as a threat while standing in his own yard, surrounded by the destruction caused by the very children Karen was defending. Neighbors began to gather, creating an impromptu audience for Karen's performance. Old Mrs. Henderson from across the street looked concerned. The Rodriguez family, who had lived next door to Mark for years, watched with a mixture of disbelief and sympathy. As Karen continued her dramatic 911 call, Mark realized this was no longer just a simple neighborhood dispute. This had become something much larger, a potential legal and personal nightmare that could destroy everything he had worked for. The carefully maintained garden, the memories of his mother, his reputation in the neighborhood, all of it hung in a delicate balance. The sound of approaching police sirens cut through the summer afternoons, signaling that the situation was about to reach a critical turning point. Local law enforcement arrived, responding to Karen's urgent call. To their credit, the officers approached the situation professionally. They listened to both sides, carefully examining the property damage and interviewing neighbors who had witnessed the ongoing conflicts. Mark's documentation of previous incidents, including photographs of destroyed landscaping, provided a clear picture of the repeated violations.